This is lecture 4. We're going to look at inside the lobbying game. Uh, in essence, we're going to look in the next two lectures how all this works. At this point, we're going to look at iron triangles and things like that. 5, we'll look at what governs lobbyists. This will be a little bit longer of a lecture. 5 will be shorter. 6 should be pretty short since we've already covered PACs before, but we have to cover them again. Okay, now with interest groups. We know that interest groups, this says it all. Here you are at the healthcare reform, which would be the ACA, or this actually could have fit in 1993 with the healthcare plan that the Clintons put forth in the first year of his presidency. And you see everybody basically sharpening their knives, getting ready to carve this thing up because there's no way it's going to be passed in the form that it's sitting now. And they all want, of course, their piece of the pie, and they're representing all different sorts of groups. Something I really probably don't have to explain to you. Now, groups, interest groups promote public policies, and they encourage the participation of their members. They support candidates for public office, and they work to influence policyholders. Modern government actually provides a supportive environment for interest groups. Now, of course, they're protected by the Constitution's First Amendment provisions. And one of the other reasons is, as we've seen when we looked at the first unit, government has gotten so big that it intrudes in our daily lives, and modern government is involved in so many issues that hardly any interest in society could fail to benefit significantly from having influence over federal policies or programs. Just look at President Obama saying he'd like to make community college free. Well, groups are already organizing for and against. Someone's going to benefit, somebody's going to be hurt, so they're trying to either defeat it, mitigate it, whatever. Now we know that lobbying too simply is an effort of groups to influence public policy through contact with public officials. And lobbying on the inside is based on group efforts to develop and maintain close contacts with policy. And all this has been made, I think, easier by technology and the instantaneous feedback that politicians can get, or when something happens, certainly the instantaneous anger that can occur when people don't like what they're seeing. But modern government is very much oriented toward action. Now, in a sense, when we look at lobbying, to break it down, lobbying is broken down into 4 major areas. It's there to influence government. It's there to provide information to government, which is probably its most important role that it plays. It's there to testify at hearings, and it's also there to help write legislation. Therefore, lobbyists really are, interest groups really are, a third house of Congress. But lobbying is a third house of Congress. We don't elect them, but they testify, they inform, they research, and they actually help write legislation, but they're not elected, which is a little bit scary, to say the least. And so their significant role is providing the information that helps shape policy. And I like this bottom here. Today we learned about the 3 equal branches of the government. Of course, nothing is equal. The executive, the media, and the lobbyists. Seems almost true nowadays, huh? Now, iron triangles and issue networks describe the patterns of group influence. But before we get to that, we need to look at what lobbying is. We're going to break it down here. So if we look at what access to officials means, it's a number of things, and I'm going to list kind of 7 of them. So inside lobbying focuses on gaining access to public officials, providing them with vital information and expressing group concerns in order to promote the group's perspective. And so its success improves with effective lobbyists, so you are going to pay big bucks for the best. And lobbyists will include anybody who is can be anybody who has served in Congress um, to wealthy Washington lawyers to community activists. As you can see with the video you watched from the Annenberg Foundation. Now, inside lobbying directed at policymakers who are inclined to support the group, um, or inside lobbying is directed at policymakers who are inclined to support the group rather than those who have opposed it in the past. Um, that's why they want to engage in elections and try to elect people who are favorable to their causes. Now, money is the mother's milk of politics. And so money is an essential ingredient of inside lobbying to the high level of funding required to mount an effective lobbying effort in Washington. Um, Many lobby firms are based on K Street, high rents, well-paid lobbyists, the things that you do in order to run an organization. It needs to be very, very well funded. Now, the medium of exchange for most inside lobbying is information. Remember, I said information is the most important thing that lobby groups give to congressmen and members of the executive branch. And lobbying Congress has some interesting aspects. A lobbyist can benefit from a close relationship with members of Congress. Lobbyists help groups obtain legislative help. Trusted lobbyists also help Congress by identifying bills that deserve their attention or support. Again, information. Lobbyists' effectiveness depends on fair play. You have to tell it like it is. You have to tell it straight. You can put a little bit of your spin on it, but you have to be truthful. Caught in a lie, your effectiveness may be damaged forever. Congressional action requires a compromise among interests. One time your friend may next time be your adversary, so you don't want to play too hard or too easy, but you want to play fair, and you want to be able to compromise. You're not going to get everything that you want in the pluralist system. You won't. You want to provide. So instance, you want to provide information. You want to rely on longtime allies among Congress, and you want to push steadily but not too aggressively for your legislative goals. And usually, you'll be somewhat successful. Now, lobbying executive agencies works in a lot of ways the same way. You begin working with government agencies. In fact, at one point, you might have worked for them. We call this the revolving door, which we're going to look at as a problem with lobbyists. We look at number 5, lecture 5. The link between groups and bureaucracy is most evident with regulatory agencies that oversee the nation's business sectors, the SEC, the FCC, the FEC. And so, for instance, the FCC is an example of agency capture. Regulatory agencies pass through a series of phases that constitute a life cycle as they look at something. They're doing that right now with the internet, with one side pushing for the more you pay, the faster your internet is, while the other side is pushing what we call net neutrality. It's going through this cycle right now, these phases. So the FCC originally was supposed to regulate an industry on the public's behalf. Remember, the FCC is the Federal Communications Commission. But as the agency matures, like the EPA, which was established in the late 1960s, it begins to protect the status quo, or it fails or it falls captive to the very industry it's supposed to regulate. And so at times it seems as if instead of the Environmental Protection Agency making policy, the oil companies or the energy companies are. But then when the shoe's on the other foot, it perhaps can be said that they go too far in regulating energy so that it raises the cost of energy for all of us, which isn't what we want either. Now, the third thing is the lobbying in the courts. And we'll just look at 3 things here, but we're going to go over them again. One, of course, is the influence on the selection of federal judges. Each side wants the type of judge that they think will be favorable if a case comes before them. that will be favorable to the interest group's interests. There's what we call an amicus curiae. I've also heard it pronounced amicus curiae, which is a short for friend of the court, or Latin for friend of the court brief. What that does, and I'll give you an example. Casey Martin was a professional golfer in the 2000-2005 era. He may still be golfing for all I know. But he had a problem with his legs, so he asked the PGA if they would allow him to ride in a golf cart. And the PGA said no, that would give him an unfair advantage over golfers who had to walk the entire course. He wouldn't get as tired, which would give him an advantage, theoretically. So he sued in court. The courts heard the case, and a friend of the court brief was filed. Many of them were filed on behalf of groups that represented the disabled in favor of Casey Martin, while other friend of the court briefs were filed on behalf of the PGA, which thought that the court should resolve the case differently. Ultimately, it found in favor of Casey Martin, and he was allowed to ride a golf cart during tournaments. I'm not sure that I really heard much about him after that. And then the third thing are what we call class action lawsuits. Now, class action lawsuits usually get a small number of people in which a suit revolves around. The difference in a class action suit, though, is that a class action suit, even though it represents a small number of people as litigants, can affect a large number of people. So class action means a class of people. Even though your name may not be on the lawsuit, you certainly could benefit from that. We've seen everything from Apple batteries to bad mortgages that were given out in 2007 and 2008, and mortgage companies are being forced to give back some of the money that they took from bondholders. Now, if we see this here, there's a triangle. The triangle is in black. The actions are in red, and in essence, the flow itself is represented in blue. Now we know that iron triangles and issue networks describe the toe patterns or the flow patterns of group influence through which most public policy is decided. Now, iron triangles consists of a small and informal but relatively stable set of bureaucrats, legislators, and lobbyists. Now, many of these in these iron triangles will have been long-term congressmen, lobbyists who have represented the same interest group, and because bureaucrats, 90% of bureaucrats are lifers. Let's say they're there for life. They're also going to be on the job, and these three disparate groups seek to develop policies that are beneficial to a particular interest. So I'll give you two examples. The American Dairy Association, or the American beef producers. Let's say the ADA, the American Dairy Association, would like to raise the subsidies that dairy farmers get, and so they put pressure on both the Department of Agriculture, and they also put pressure on the agricultural committees of the Senate and the House in order to get them to raise the milk support price. And what that simply means is that government has told dairy farmers that they will get a base level for all the milk that they produce. Now, that means that it's that regardless of what the market is, regardless of whether that all that milk is being consumed or not, they're going to get that subsidy. And that means that we pay higher prices as consumers, but it does keep farmers in business. I'm not sure, what is best and what isn't best. Now, issue networks have become more common than iron triangles in the last 20 years, and it's an informal grouping of officials, lobbyists, and policy specialists, the network, who are brought together by their shared interest and expertise in a particular area. And as a matter of fact, it may be that a number of opposing groups are in the same issue network. they have um, a great deal of policy expertise. They're less stable. They're less clearly defined in comparison to the Iron Triangle. But ultimately they're the result of the increasing complexity and the interconnectivity of policy problems that face the nation. Nothing exists in a void. Um, Even the things that the Iron Triangle takes on doesn't exist in a void, but the issues that the Iron Triangle takes on are certainly in most cases probably less complex than what the issue networks are taking on. Now let's look at the tactics. So what do they use when they are lobbying? Well, there's the use of the mass media. Get your message out. So the internet, television, radio, etc., etc. It used to be fax, but we don't see much in the way of faxes anymore. It's more email, internet, etc. Then there's boycotting, and again, boycotts usually don't work, but people like to make a big deal out of it. It's very short-lived. Two examples would be now the National Organization of Women's boycott of states that didn't ratify the ERA. Since you probably haven't heard about it, it's kind of a statement on how effective it was. Civil rights groups for a while boycotted South Carolina, said we're not going to hold any conventions or recommended people visit South Carolina because they were still flying the Confederate flag at the state capitol. They no longer do. With litigation, if you are an interest group and you fail in one area, the courts may be able to provide you with a remedy, whereas you couldn't get it through legislation. The courts may look at it a little bit differently and say, oh, this is something that we should perhaps rule on. And again, the amicus curiae briefs that we talked about a little while ago, the front of the court briefs, class action lawsuits. And then in the area of politics, we had the campaign contributions, we had the endorsement of candidates. Not that that matters for the most part, except if you're endorsed or opposed perhaps by the NRA. Then it becomes a little bit more of a higher visibility. Lots of groups issue report cards. Oh, candidate X got a 0 on the environment, whereas candidate Y got 100 from the NRA because they're all about guns and they support the Second Amendment and all of that. And then a couple more. There's as far as tactics go, there are 3 things that are used at the state level: the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. There's nothing like that at the federal level. But at the state level and at the local level, the initiative, which is bottom up, the referendum, which is top down, and the recall, which is to take and oppose elected officials, and if they lose the recall, they're forced out of office. Doesn't happen very often, but it happened here in California in 2002 with Gray Davis. So that's a look at lecture 4. That's a look at iron triangles. It's the look at a little bit of tactics and why lobbying occurs. Our next lecture will be lecture 5, and I'm sure you can't wait, because I sure can't.